On a February night in 2008, a car carrying a young married couple leaves the road on a lonely stretch of highway between Quetta and Rahim Yar Khan. It rolls, it comes to rest in a ditch, far from any hospital, any ambulance, any real help. The man climbs out with cuts and bruises. The woman does not climb out at all. She is 21 years old. She has a fine arts degree half finished, a 2-year-old marriage already showing cracks, and no idea that this single night on a Balochistan highway will end the life she had planned and begin another one entirely as a painter, a mother, a broadcaster, and eventually one of the most recognized humanitarian voices to come out of Pakistan. History will come to know her by a nickname that captures the choice she made in the years that followed. Not victim, and not even simply survivor, but Iron Lady. This is the story of Muneba Mazari. Chapter 1, a girl from Rahim Yar Khan * visual, Rahim Yar Khan cityscape, southern Punjab map, childhood. Style art supplies * Muneba Mazari Balok was born on the 3rd of March 1987 in Rahim Yar Khan, a city in the far south of Punjab province, close to the borders of both Balochistan and Sindh. She belonged to the Mazari, a well-known Balok tribe, and she grew up in a household that held fairly traditional expectations for a daughter, the kind of household where a woman's future was expected to run through marriage and family long before it ran through a career, let alone a public one. The Mazari carry a long, prominent history in the tribal politics of the region, and the name is not unfamiliar in Pakistani public life. But prominence in tribal terms did not automatically translate into freedom for the women born into it. Like many girls in southern Punjab and Balochistan at the time, Muniba grew up understanding, without anyone needing to say it outright, that her life already had a fairly fixed shape waiting for her. Her school, marriage, household, children, in that order, with little room for detours, that made Muniba something of an outlier from the start. Even as a small child, she was drawn to color, sketching, doodling, filling margins and scraps of paper, long before anyone around her suggested that art could be more than a pastime. She attended Army public school and later enrolled in a Bachelor of Fine Arts program in her hometown. For a girl raised in a conservative, tradition-bound family, simply choosing to study fine arts was already a quiet act of defiance. It was one of the only ambitions she had ever really claimed for herself. She did not get to pursue it entirely on her own terms. In her family, as in many others in the region, marriage came early, and it came first. At 18, an age when many of her classmates were still deciding what to study, let alone who to marry, Muniba was married to Khurram Shahzad, a pilot with the Pakistan Air Force. By her own later accounts, it was a match shaped more by her father's wishes and family tradition than by personal choice. She would eventually complete her degree alongside her new married life, but the girl who had once imagined building an entire future around a paintbrush now found herself building a life around it. Someone else's postings, someone else's schedule, someone else's plans. For roughly 2 years that was simply her life. A young wife adjusting to a new household, an artist with her ambitions quietly set aside, waiting for a someday that never quite seemed to arrive. She had no reason yet to imagine that her someday would arrive not through choice, but through catastrophe on a highway in the dark, on a night she would spend the rest of her life remembering it. Fragments, she could not have known it then, but the road out of that folded. A version of her life had already begun. It just didn't look anything like a road to freedom. It looked like a road from Quetta. Chapter 2. The road from Quetta * visual, remote highway, Balochistan terrain, jeep on unpaved road * on the 27th of February 2008. Muniba and her husband were making the long drive from Quetta in Balochistan back home to Rahim Yar Khan. It is a punishing distance by road, stretching across some of the most remote terrain in the country, and by the time they were well into the journey, fatigue had set in. At the wheel, Khurram fell asleep. The car veered off the highway. It went into a ditch. In the chaos of the crash, Khurram was thrown clear, or managed to climb free. Accounts describe him escaping with only minor injuries. Muniba did not get out. She was trapped inside the wreckage, and in the minutes that followed, strangers and passers-by worked to pull her free. It was, by her own later description, during that extraction that the worst of the internal damage occurred, the kind of injury that changes not just a body, but an entire life. The list of what she sustained that night is long. Her right arm was broken in 2 places. Her shoulder blade and collarbone were fractured. Her rib cage was crushed, damaging her lungs and injuring her liver. And most devastating of all, 3 vertebrae in her spine were shattered, severing the connection between her brain and the lower half of her body. There was no ambulance waiting on that stretch of highway. The crash had happened in a remote part of Balochistan, far from any hospital equipped to handle trauma of this scale. She was lifted into the back of a jeep for the journey to the nearest town, hours away over unpaved, uneven roads. She has since described that ride as one of the clearest memories she carries from that night. Broken in places she could still feel, and numb in places she could not, beginning to understand, jolt by jolt, mile by mile, that her body had been divided into 2 halves that no longer matched, one that hurt, and one that terrifyingly did not hurt at all because it could no longer feel anything. The first hospital they reached did not have what she needed. There was no equipment for spinal trauma, no surgical team prepared for injuries this severe. She was moved again to Rahim Yar Khan, and again found the facilities weren't sufficient. Eventually, she was transferred all the way to Karachi, to the Aga Khan University Hospital, one of the few facilities in the country equipped to treat her. By the time she reached a surgical team that could actually help her, hours had already passed since the crash. She went into surgery carrying fractures across nearly half her skeleton, an injured liver, damaged lungs, and a spinal cord injury so severe that no operation was going to reverse it. The surgeons could stabilize her. They could not give her back what the accident had taken. She woke up in a hospital bed as a different person than the one who had climbed into that car in Quetta. 21 years old, a fine arts student, a new wife, and now, though she did not have the full word for it yet, a woman who would never walk again. Chapter 3, 2 years on a bed * visual, hospital room, wheelchair, physiotherapy session *. The word the doctors eventually used was paraplegia, permanent paralysis from the waist down. The result of a spinal cord injury that surgery could not undo. Muniba had also lost control of her bladder in the crash, meaning she would need to manage a catheter bag for the rest of her life, a detail she would later discuss publicly with a bluntness that surprised people used to more delicate conversations about disability. What followed was not a single dramatic turning point, but 2 long years of something much harder, stillness. Confined first to a hospital bed, and then a bed at home, she faced a recovery with no fixed timeline and no guarantee of the outcome she wanted. She had to relearn how to exist inside a body that no longer obeyed her the way it once had. She had to grieve for her mobility, for her independence, for a version of her future that had quietly ended on that Balochistan highway, even though she herself had survived it. It would be easy, looking back from the vantage point of everything she went on to build, to skip past this part of the story, to move straight from accident to artist, as if resilience were instant. It wasn't. For 2 years, Muniba's world shrank to the size of a room. Physiotherapy came slowly in small, grinding increments. A finger, a wrist, the strength to sit upright a little longer, the first tentative sessions in a wheelchair. Every gain was earned, not given. There is also a quieter grief that rarely makes it into short biographical summaries, the loss of a certain kind of privacy. A body that once belonged entirely to her now required help from nurses, from family members, from her husband, for even the most basic daily tasks. Every part of recovering, bathing, dressing, learning to transfer in and out of a wheelchair, had to be relearned in front of other people at an age when most 21-year-olds are only beginning to feel fully independent. It was, in its own way, as disorienting as the paralysis itself. Her marriage, already built on foundations that were more obligation than partnership, now had to absorb an entirely new weight. Khurram had married a fine arts student who could walk into any room on her own. He now found himself married to a woman whose daily life required more care, more patience, and more adjustment than either of them had been prepared for. The strain that would eventually end their marriage did not appear all at once. It accumulated quietly across those 2 bedridden years. Eventually, physically able to manage a wheelchair and needing to rebuild her life outside a hospital room, Muniba relocated to Rawalpindi. She was, on paper, recovered, stable, mobile with assistance, no longer confined to a bed. But recovery for her was only just beginning to mean something entirely different than it once had. She was not going to walk again. She was, however, about to discover that this did not mean her life was over. It meant it needed to be rebuilt from a different set of materials. One of the very first of those materials was something she had picked up almost by accident in a hospital room, simply to survive the boredom and the grief of lying still, a paintbrush. Chapter 4. Let your walls wear colors *visual. Paintbrush and canvas, abstract mixed. Media artwork, hospital. Room painting, Muniba had studied fine arts before the accident. But painting had always been something she did alongside her life, not something that held it together, that changed in the hospital. Lying in bed for months at a stretch, unable to do most of the things that had once filled her days, she began to paint simply to give herself something to look at besides the ceiling and the Roman drip. She has described those early hospital paintings as a way of adding color to what were, in every sense, dull and sad moments, an attempt to put something bright into days that otherwise offered her very little. It was, in her own later telling, painting that kept her alive during that stretch of her recovery, not metaphorically, but literally, as a reason to stay present and engaged when despair would have been the easier option. What began as distraction slowly became identity. As she regained more movement and more independence, her painting grew more ambitious, mixed. Media, largely abstract work, built around human faces, expressions, and figures, often rendered in bold. Saturated color, even when the emotional subject matter was heavy. Her art rarely stayed purely decorative. It carried grief, anger, hope, and endurance side by side on the same canvas, which is perhaps why she eventually gave her body of work a name that fused the 2 halves of her experience together. She began calling her paintings her pain, things of art built directly out of what had hurt her. She built a brand around this work, called Muniba's Canvas, with a slogan that doubled as something closer to a personal philosophy. Let your walls wear colors. On the surface, it was a simple statement about interior decorating by the art, brightened the room. Underneath, it carried the logic of everything she had lived through since that night on the highway. That even the most damaged, confined spaces, a hospital room, a body that no longer moved the way it used to, a life that looked nothing like the one that had been planned, could still be filled with color, if you were willing to do the work of making it so. Painting did not undo the accident. It did not give her back the use of her legs, or the marriage she had entered at 18, or the version of herself that existed before February 2008. But it gave her something to build with, and in the years that followed, she would need every bit of that material, because the hardest parts of rebuilding her life were still ahead of her. Chapter 5. A son named Nail * visual. Mother and child silhouette. Family photographs * in 2011. 4 years after the crash that changed her body, Muniba made a decision that would change the shape of her life all over again. She became a mother. She adopted a son and named him Nail. For a woman whose injuries had raised painful questions from doctors, from relatives, from a society not always gentle in how it discussed disability and womanhood in the same sentence, about whether she could still be a wife, a mother, or a complete woman by the standards she'd been raised with, adoption was not a fallback. It was a deliberate answer. Motherhood to Muniba did not require the particular biological history other people assumed it needed. It required showing up every day for a child who needed her. She has spoken since about how becoming Nail's mother gave her something that 2 years of physiotherapy alone never could. A reason that pulled her forward, rather than just a body she was learning to manage. Raising a son sharpened her focus outward, toward children's welfare, education, and the wider question of what kind of world she wanted him to grow up in. Much of the activism she would become known for in the years ahead, around women's rights, children's rights, and disability inclusion, traces a direct line back to this decision, made quietly, at a point when many people assumed her story was already over. Adoption was not an entirely uncomplicated choice within her social context either. Conversations about infertility, disability, and family lineage in South Asian households can be fraught even without the added layer of a widely publicized accident, and Muniba chose to have this particular conversation about a family not defined by biology in public, on television and on stage, rather than treat it as a private matter to be managed quietly. In doing so, she opened space for a discussion many Pakistani families have but rarely have out loud. It was in a real sense just beginning to widen. Muniba was no longer only rebuilding a life for herself. She was building one for 2 people in a household that looked nothing like the one she'd once pictured as a teenage bride in Rahim Yar Khan, and by her own account a far happier one. Chapter 6. When a marriage ends * visual. Courthouse exterior, empty chair, sill, wet alone * the marriage that had brought Muniba to that highway in the first place did not survive what came after it. She and Khurram separated in 2014 and formally divorced in 2015. A decade into a relationship that had started as an arranged match and ended under the weight of a life-altering disability that one partner adjusted to and the other ultimately could not. Muniba has spoken candidly, if not always in great detail, about the toll her disability took on the marriage, about a husband who, in her account, struggled to remain committed once the reality of her paralysis became permanent rather than a temporary crisis to wait out. In a country where divorce still carried, and in many circles still carries, significant social stigma, being a divorced woman was difficult enough. Being a divorced woman who used a wheelchair in a culture not always generous toward visible disability added a second layer of judgment she would have to publicly and repeatedly push back against. For years afterward, the end of the marriage was not the end of the conflict. In 2017, Khurram filed a defamation lawsuit against her, seeking 10 million Pakistani rupees in damages over public comments she had made about their relationship. The case moved through the courts for months before a judge dismissed it in January of 2018, a legal vindication, though not one that undid the years of public scrutiny the dispute had brought with rather than retreat from the subject, Muniba increasingly leaned into it. She began speaking openly, in interviews and on stage, about the specific stigma faced by disabled women navigating divorce and independence in a society that often treated both as either impossible or improper for a woman in her position. What could have remained a private wound instead became one of the clearest through lines in her public advocacy, a refusal to let other people's discomfort with her circumstances dictate how she talked about her own life. By the time the lawsuit was dismissed, Muniba was no longer simply a private citizen whose personal life had spilled into the courts. She had already begun stepping onto a very different kind of stage, one she had first walked onto 3 years earlier in Islamabad in front of a TEDx audience that had no idea it was about to help launch a public career. # Chapter 7, 14 minutes in Islamabad * visual, TEDx stage, spotlight, audience silhouettes * in November of 2014, while still living through the fallout of her failing marriage. Muneba Mazari sat in her wheelchair on a stage in Islamabad to deliver a TEDx talk. She used the stage to tell, in her own words, the story of the crash, the ditch outside Quetta, the jeep ride to the first hospital, the surgeries, the diagnosis, the 2 years in bed. She described the moment she understood that part of her body could still feel pain, and part of it could no longer feel anything at all, and the choice she made afterward not to let either half define the whole of who she was. It was not a polished, sanitized account of recovery. It was blunt about grief, about anger, about how long it actually takes to rebuild a sense of self after catastrophic loss. And underneath all of that, it was a talk about refusing to give up. The speech did what good TED talks are built to do. It traveled. Clips and recordings spread well beyond the room in Islamabad, and Muniba, until then known, if at all, only within her own circles, found herself becoming a public figure almost overnight. Audiences responded not to a simplified inspirational story, but to the specificity and honesty of hers. A young, divorced, disabled mother from southern Punjab, refusing to be defined by any one of those words. Among the people who noticed was a director at Pakistan Television, the state broadcaster. He reached out after seeing her talk and offered her something no Pakistani network had offered a wheelchair user before: a job in front of the camera. It was an unusual, even risky, decision within an industry that had never featured a visibly disabled woman as an on-air host, and it became the next chapter of Muniba's reinvention. The girl who had once quietly studied fine arts because a public career wasn't for women like her was, 6 years after nearly dying on a Balochistan highway, about to become one of the most visible women on Pakistani television. # Chapter 8, Pakistan's first * visual, television studio, camera and lights, news desk * Muniba Mazari's move into broadcasting was not a footnote in her story. It was a genuine first Pakistani media. She became the country's first wheelchair using female television host and model, appearing on camera in an industry where disability, when it appeared at all, was rarely represented by disabled people themselves. She went on to host programming including Hum News' social issues show, * Main Nohai Hum *, using her platform not simply to be seen, but to talk about gender, about disability, about the everyday discrimination faced by people who didn't fit the narrow physical mold Pakistani television had long presented as normal. For viewers who had never seen a wheelchair user leading a national broadcast, her presence alone did a kind of advocacy work that no single episode's content could fully capture. Representation in her case was the message before she'd said a single word. She also modeled another space where her presence pushed against assumptions about whose bodies were considered presentable, marketable, or aspirational. It was not without resistance. Pakistan's media and fashion industries, like many around the world, had rarely made room for visibly disabled women in front of the camera, and Muniba's visibility forced conversations the industry hadn't previously had to have. What that visibility unlocked is difficult to measure in numbers, but easy to see in effect. For a Pakistani viewer who used a wheelchair, or loved someone who did, watching a host lead a national broadcast from one, competently, confidently, without the segment being framed as a special feature about disability, communicated something no explicit statement could. That this, too, was simply what a modern newsroom could look like. None of this erased the difficulty of the years that preceded it. But it marked a clear turning point. The woman who had spent 2 years unable to leave a bed was now, less than a decade later, someone millions of Pakistanis recognized on sight. Not despite her wheelchair, but often specifically because of what her presence in that wheelchair, on their television screens, represented. Television gave her a national audience. It would not be long before her audience became a global one. Chapter 9. Paintings continued * visual, gallery opening, framed canvases on white walls, exhibition crowd * even as her television career grew. Muniba never set down the paintbrush, had helped keep her steady through her hospital years. If anything, her art matured alongside her public profile, moving out of hospital rooms and private studios and onto gallery walls. In April of 2016, 27 of her works were displayed at the Collectors' Gallery in Lahore, a substantial solo showing for an artist who, less than a decade earlier, had picked up painting purely as a survival mechanism. Her work also traveled internationally. An exhibition titled * and I Choose to Live * was held in Dubai, hosted by the Embassy of Pakistan alongside Poetic Strokes and the Collectors' Galleria, putting her mixed media pieces in front of an audience well beyond Pakistan's borders. She contributed work to charitable causes as well, including events supporting the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, using her art not just as personal expression but as a fundraising tool for people facing their own forms of displacement and loss. Her paintings remained, stylistically, abstract and expressive, bold color fields interrupted by human faces and figures, often ambiguous in mood, simultaneously beautiful and unsettled. Audiences and critics alike tended to read her biography into the work, and she rarely discouraged the connection. The pain, things of framing she had given her art early on, continued to hold. These were not paintings that happened to be made by a woman who had survived a catastrophic injury. They were in large part about that survival, about what it looked like to keep creating beauty from a body and a life that had been, quite literally, broken and rebuilt. Muniba's canvas grew from a coping mechanism into a genuine art brand, one she continued to build even as her fame in broadcasting and public speaking expanded. Rather than choosing between the roles of artist, broadcaster, and advocate, she simply accumulated them, each one reinforcing the reach of the others. A television audience that recognized her face was more likely to seek out her paintings. An art audience moved by her paintings was more likely to watch her interviews. And both audiences, increasingly, were hearing the same underlying message, delivered through whichever medium reached them first. By the second half of the 2010s, that message had found its way onto a much larger stage than a Lahore gallery or a Pakistani television studio. Chapter 10. The Ambassador * visual, UN emblem, conference hall, Islamabad event stage * in December of 2015. UN women named Muneba Mazari as Pakistan's first national goodwill ambassador, and, more broadly, the first Pakistani ever to hold a UN goodwill ambassador role for the organization. The appointment came during an event in Islamabad marking the end of the annual 16 days of activism against gender-based violence campaign, and it formalized a role she had, in practice, already been playing since her TEDx talk the year before. As Goodwill Ambassador, Muniba used her platform to push directly on issues of gender caste-based violence, gender equality, and women's empowerment, framing these not as women's issues alone, but as challenges that required men and women working together to solve. She argued publicly more than once that lasting change on gender discrimination required educating boys and men alongside girls and women, rather than treating equality as a cause only half the population needed to care about. Her advocacy widened from there. She spoke out on children's rights and education, on mental health, a subject still heavily stigmatized in much of Pakistani society, and inevitably on disability rights, drawing directly from her own experience navigating a country not built with wheelchair users in mind. She became known for reframing her own suffering not as something to hide or minimize, but as a point of connection. She has often said that she considers her pain beautiful, precisely because it lets her recognize and sit with the pain of others rather than looking away from it. That philosophy found one of its most powerful expressions in her relationship with Walid Khan, a survivor of the 2014 terrorist attack on the Army Public School in Peshawar, in which militants killed more than 100 students and staff. Khan, shot while trying to protect his classmates, was left wheelchair, bound by his injuries. Muniba has described him as her own real life hero, a young man whose survival and resilience mirrored, and in some ways surpassed, her own, and whose story she has helped amplify alongside her. Her growing international profile brought formal recognition. In 2015, the BBC included her on its list of 100 women, a global roundup of influential and inspiring women released each year. The following year, Forbes named her to its 30 under 30 list in the media and marketing category, placing her alongside young innovators and creators from around the world. She was later listed among the Muslim 500, an annual accounting of the world's most influential Muslims. None of these titles replaced the harder, slower work of advocacy itself, the interviews, the talks, the meetings, the endless task of explaining over and over why representation and inclusion mattered to audiences not always inclined to think about it. But together, they marked an unmistakable trajectory. A woman once written off medically and socially as someone whose life had effectively ended in a Balochistan ditch, had become one of the most internationally recognized voices to come out of Pakistan in a generation. Chapter 11, Iron Lady * visual, montage of magazine covers, social media grid, speaking events * somewhere across the television appearances, the TEDx talks, the gallery openings, and the UN appointments. Muneba Mazari picked up the nickname that would follow her for the rest of her career, the Iron Lady of Pakistan. It is, on its surface, a simple label, an easy shorthand for she went through something terrible and didn't break. But it also risks flattening a much more complicated reality into something more palatable. A story where suffering is neatly resolved by strength, and where resilience looks effortless and finished, rather than ongoing and hard. Muniba herself has generally resisted that flattened version. In interviews across the years, she has been consistent about the fact that her recovery was neither instant nor complete in the way inspirational shorthand tends to suggest, that she still manages chronic pain, still deals with the practical and social barriers of navigating a country not designed for wheelchair users, and still occasionally has to push back against people who reduce her entire identity to the fact of her disability. What made her genuinely influential was not that she stopped feeling pain, but that she refused to let it stay silent or private. She built a career, a following, and eventually an international platform out of talking publicly about exactly the things: chronic disability, divorce, single motherhood, mental health, gender discrimination that Pakistani public life had traditionally preferred to keep behind closed doors. By the late 2010s, that willingness had made her one of the most followed public figures to emerge from Pakistan in the social media era, with a combined audience across Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and X numbering in the millions. She used that reach less like a celebrity managing a brand and more like a broadcaster who had simply found a bigger studio, sharing her art, her advocacy, updates on her family, and consistently of the same core message she had first delivered from a wheelchair on a TED stage in 2014. Setbacks were real. They were not, on their own, the end of the story. The Iron Lady nickname stuck because year after year she kept giving people new reasons to use it, not by pretending to be unbreakable, but by repeatedly choosing in public to keep going anyway. Chapter 12. Advocate for every body * visual. United Nations Headquarters World Map. Global Summit Imagery * nearly a decade after her first UN appointment. Muneba Mazari's advocacy reached a new stage. On the 24th of March 2025, United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres appointed her a Sustainable Development Goals advocate, with a specific focus on disability and inclusion, joining a small, hand-picked group of global figures, including heads of state, chosen to promote the UN's development agenda on the world stage. The appointment, formally announced later that year, built directly on nearly 10 years of work as UN Women's National Goodwill Ambassador for Pakistan, but it also marked a subtle shift in emphasis. Where her earlier UN role had centered primarily on gender equality, the SDG advocate position placed disability inclusion itself at the center of her global mandate, recognition that her lived experience as a wheelchair user gave her a distinct authority on a set of issues the international development community was increasingly trying to prioritize. Speaking to UN News later that year about the through line connecting all of it, the accident, the recovery, the painting, the broadcasting, the ambassadorships, Muniba pointed back to the same idea she had been articulating in one form or another since that first TEDx talk, that facing hardship with courage and persistence is what allows barriers to become bridges, and adversity to become opportunity. It was less a new insight than a philosophy she had spent nearly 2 decades testing against her own life, chapter by chapter, and finding it held up. By 2025, SDG Advocate was simply the newest line on a resume that already included artist, model, singer, television anchor, motivational speaker, humanitarian, and UN Goodwill Ambassador. What tied all of those roles together was never the titles themselves, but the same underlying insistence that had carried her out of a hospital bed in 2008, that a body which no longer works, way it once did, is not a life that has stopped working. It is a life that has to be rebuilt on different terms, and the rebuilding, however slow and however painful, is worth doing in public, where other people navigating their own versions of catastrophe might see it and recognize themselves in it. Nearly 2 decades after the crash outside Quetta, Muneba Mazari was no longer only telling her own story. She had become part of a much larger, ongoing global conversation about who gets to be visible, whose bodies get represented, and whose pain gets taken seriously, a conversation her own life, more than any single speech, had helped push forward. Closing, what she leaves behind * visual. Sunrise over Rahim Yarkon, wheelchair and paintbrush side by side. Fade to color *. It would be simple to end this story the way so many retellings of it already do, with the word inspiring, and a tidy moral about overcoming adversity. Muneba Mazari's own account of her life resists that tidiness, and it's worth resisting it here too. She did not overcome her disability in any sense that erased it. She still uses a wheelchair. She still manages the practical realities of paralysis every day, in a country that remains, in many places, poorly equipped for accessibility. Her first marriage still ended in painful public circumstances. Her relationship with her own body, by her own account, is still a work in progress nearly 2 decades on not a triumphant finish line she crossed once and never had to think about again. What she actually built across those 2 decades was something more durable than a single inspirational narrative, an ongoing public life constructed in full view out of exactly the materials most people are taught to hide: chronic pain, divorce, disability, single motherhood, grief. She turned each of those, one at a time, into subject matter, for her paintings, for her broadcasts, for her speeches, for her advocacy work with UN Women, and later, as a sustainable development. Goals advocate for disability and inclusion. Along the way, she became undeniably a list of firsts, Pakistan's first wheel, her using female television host, its first UN Goodwill Ambassador, a Forbes 30 under 30 honoree, a name on BBC's 100 Women list, one of the Muslim world's most cited influential figures. But reducing her story to that list of achievements risks missing what actually made them possible. 2 years of grinding, unglamorous physical and emotional recovery on a bed in Rawalpindi, followed by more than a decade of choosing, repeatedly, to speak in public about things Pakistani society had generally preferred kept private. The slogan she gave her own art brand back when she was still a relatively unknown painter working through her grief was *, let your walls wear colors. *, it turned out to describe her entire life. Approach not just her canvases. The walls, in her case, were never just the ones in a room waiting to be decorated. They were the limits placed on her by a car accident, by a failed marriage, by a society with fixed ideas about what a disabled, divorced woman was allowed to become. She never pretended those walls weren't real. She simply kept insisting, one painting, one broadcast, one speech, one appointment at a time, that they didn't have to stay bare. Muneba Mazari is still painting, still speaking, still raising her son, still showing up on stages and screens, and now on a global platform advocating for a more inclusive world. Still telling anyone who will listen that a broken body is not the same thing as a broken life. The girl from Rahim Yar Khan, who once folded away her own ambitions to become someone's wife, became instead one of the clearest voices Pakistan has produced on what it actually looks like to rebuild in public imperfectly, one color at a time. There is a reading of Iron Lady that imagines iron as something cold and impenetrable, a metal that simply refuses to bend. Muneba Mazari's version looks more like iron the way it exists in a blacksmith's shop, something that had to be put through fire first, hammered and reshaped under pressure, before it could hold any useful form at all. She was not born unbreakable. She was broken on a highway outside Quetta, in ways doctors could measure precisely on an X-ray. What came afterward wasn't the absence of that break. It was everything she chose to build around it.